We all want to make better landings, but I feel like these are some of the tips that often get overlooked, but they make such a huge difference. And the first rule of making good landings is to not get spoiled on long runways. A lot of times when we get to a really long runway, like my home airport of Addison here in North Texas, it's thousands and thousands of feet long. And if you're not careful, you can just kind of land whenever you land. So if you carry too much speed and you just float in ground effect, no big deal. You had 7,000 feet of runway to work with. But then when you go in the backcountry or go into some sort of unpaved strip and it's 2,000 feet or maybe shorter than that, you really work yourself into a bad situation because you've gotten spoiled on only landing on these runways that big jets land on. So we really want to get really disciplined about making great landings even on long runways. And the way you can do that is to really pick a spot. Have a spot landing even if the runway is 10,000 feet long. At Addison, I really tried to make the first turnoff to the taxiway. Now, I don't do that every time, and I also don't screech the brakes trying to make the first turnoff, but I really tried to approach it in a disciplined fashion and not really remember that I've got thousands of feet to work with. The second tip for great landings is to make sure you're practicing slow flight. A lot of times our muscle memory is just built in cruise, and so we feel how much energy the airplane has, both in the flight controls and then even just in our seat, kind of how buoyant the airplane might feel. And that's very, very different than how it should feel in a landing configuration when the airplane's really getting mushy and you don't have as much kind of firmness under your seat because the airplane just doesn't have as much lift and as much energy to work with. But that's not a bad thing. You just have to really, really get comfortable with it. And the way you get comfortable with it is through slow flight. So you should have learned this in your private training, but a lot of people just do it for their private and then never do it again. But slow flight is one of the best ways that you can learn energy management. And energy management is one of the best ways to get really good at landing. So that can be a really, really good flight for you to go take, is just to go out and practice slow flight. Next is to trim for airspeed. And I don't just mean use a little bit of trim, I mean use it religiously. Trim is your best friend because one of the first ways to make a really bad landing
is to come in with way too much airspeed.
Way too much energy. It's really hard to then let the airplane settle because it just still wants to fly. And so my best landings I've really found are when I control airspeed with pitch and altitude and descent rate with throttle. Now, some of you out there might disagree with that and actually do it the opposite way, and really whatever works for you, it works for you. But for me, that has led me to not really chase the flight path or the glide path as much, and I just feel more in control with the airplane because all I gotta do is trim for the appropriate airspeed, and then I'm really just managing throttle to control my descent rate and my altitude. Makes a lot of sense for me. That's when I've made my best landing. So just you really, really want to nail your airspeeds, and I found the best way to do that is to use a lot of trim. Tip number 4 is one that I really haven't heard anyone else talk about before, and that's to intentionally practice flying in ground effect. One of the best ways to make really, really smooth landings is to build your sight picture for how far you are above the ground. So you're not just kind of estimating, oh, when are the wheels going to touch, when are the wheels going to touch. You kind of have a sense for how far off the ground you are, and then you can kind of grease on the tires appropriately. But you know, most of our flying either occurs just en route or actually on the ground. You know, when we take off, we're off the ground very quickly, and when we land, you're kind of in the approach, and then all of a sudden you're on the ground, and then you're taxiing. And I don't feel like there's enough practice built up to flying 5 feet above the ground or 10 feet above the ground and learning to build that sight picture of how much room do I have left between my mains, my wheels, and the ground. And so sometimes what I'll do is I will fly the length of the runway really in ground effect and either just go around or about halfway down the runway, make sure you have enough room left. I will then land the airplane. But you can come in, fly your normal approach, and then just introduce some more power and just fly in ground effect and float there. And then you can understand, okay, how far am I above the ground? What does this look like? What does this feel like? And so if you don't do that, what happens is we just build very, very little time flying in that critical altitude, just a few feet above the ground. So it's harder to just build that muscle memory. So let's spend a little bit more intentional time there in ground effect and learning how high are we actually off the ground. And tip number 5 is the biggest and best one on this list. It is to treat landings as a flight maneuver. Not just something that happens. It's not just that the airplane stalls and suddenly we're on the ground, but it's an intentional flight maneuver to put the airplane on the ground. And I'm gonna explain exactly how to do that in the video that's linked here right now on the screen. It'll absolutely help you improve your landings, so I'll see you in that video.